What we began to do was to map all of this using people who are actually living right there as our main contacts, asking them what it is that they would want to map and produce these maps with historical narratives. What all of this then meant for us is that if you want to understand cities in South Asia, you need to understand a lot of things which are impossible to codify. You will not find what you discover in these places in any official maps, in any official documents. You will find a lot of information once you start digging into places. And it becomes very important then for us to understand how to speak within the silence between the world of codified formal knowledge and the world of knowledge that is learned informally through your body, through your senses, through your sense of smell, through your sense of visual excitement, all of that. And therefore, what then began to happen was that we had to make lots of maps and we had to then figure out how to visually represent this. And this is where a number of architects began to work with us. And we found it very, very interesting that an architect's imagination of what the built environment is something which is shaped over 3-4 years of education and then subsequently through actual practice. And it sometimes makes very good sense of the world around it, and sometimes it actually is unable to capture or understand what is going on. So let me just quickly show you an image to explain what I mean, and that will also help me then to think about what I'm calling the set of issues which have to do with scale in the current moment. Can you see this image, all of you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Right.
sir.
So at the beginning of this lockdown period, I was speaking to a group of architects and asking them to begin to imagine what our living spaces are really like, especially in places where migrant workers live, especially in places where a large number of people are compelled to live in a very congested area. And this friend of mine told me that it's really impossible for me to imagine any of this. So I said, how about trying to work with the Vitruvian man and see what does it tell you about how people actually live, right? And so what you're seeing in the first image here is the queen size bed on which you'll see two human bodies, right? And then you see this. It's the same queen size bed with actually now accommodates 4 people. And if you extend the room, you actually have 6 people living in that area, right? So you have 6 people living in a room that can barely accommodate a queen size bed. And that is the nature of our housing for migrants in most of our cities. So over the last 5 months, we have actually been involved in providing a lot of relief and support to migrant workers. And in the process, we actually managed to pick up a lot of visuals in which you can see the kind of houses in which people live, the kind of neighborhoods in which they live. And what actually then comes through is, I show you another image here. You see this house, right? What you're seeing here is 2 houses with a gap between the two, which is this part of the house? Is this not part of the house? Is this public? Is this private? right? Most of the work that is supposed to happen inside the house actually happens outside the house here. But it's also a thoroughfare because people can walk through it. And what this then means is that for people who live in neighborhoods like this, a home is just not what we imagine to be the home. For us, a home is a place which has very clear boundaries. It has boundaries that tell you how many people can live there. It has boundaries that tells you who can walk through it. For most people in our cities, that is not how things work. They live in places where they imagine the entire neighborhood to be their home. Now, if you have people who think of the entire neighborhood as a home, think of what happens when we have to imagine home quarantine. We say that we have to make sure that people are confined to their homes. What you find in many of these areas is that people can be confined at best to the neighborhood. You can't confine them to their rooms because they're just too small. Not only too small, there are also people for whom actually moving out of that house means that the only way in which they can connect with other people, the only way in which they can wash their clothes is by stepping out of the house, right? So there's a third image that I wanted to show you right here. Think about what's happening with indoors in most of our houses. You find that air conditioning is also possibly the only means by which the disease can spread. Think about what's happening outside of our houses in public spaces. We are saying that we need at least 6 feet distance, and our interactions with people will have to be. Oh, sorry, thought I was showing you this. Yeah, can you see this image now?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Yeah, now we can. Yes.
Yeah. Right. So if you see in most of our public places now, there is a requirement that you need to maintain 6 feet distance if you want to be safe. And there's no way we can actually do this in any of our public spaces, right? Think about this other image. Let me pull this out. This one. This is indoors. Can you see this?
No, sir.
This one. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
We have now discovered out of the blue that our air conditioning mechanisms are possibly the places through which the disease is spreading, right? So what has happened in the last 5 months is that our built environments, whether they are inside or outside of our houses, whether they are public places or our private spaces, whatever kinds of places we are looking at, the disease has made us aware of the fact that we simply cannot take for granted any of the known ways in which we have been running our lives. We really need to rethink how we are building our homes, how we are building our public spaces, and we need to think at this point of time also about how we can actually make the places in which we are living work for us. So what do you do when you have a place like Dharavi in Bombay, or a place like Dholakpur in Hyderabad, or a place like Rasulpura in Secunderabad, where literally thousands and thousands of people are stacked on top of each other to live in a particular neighborhood, right? Let me just pull out another set of images right here to show you what has begun to happen in many of these places. Um, yes. Can you see this image?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what you're seeing in this picture is a graveyard with a dargah behind it and a place where people are collecting gas cylinders, right? This was one of the most important pieces of services that people needed during the last 5 months. Almost everywhere we had migrant workers who were living in shared accommodations with sometimes with some possibility of cooking, very often without any possibilities of cooking because they were actually working with restaurants. And because they were working with restaurants, they were eating in those restaurants, and with the restaurant shutting down, no income, and they had to find a place where they can actually cook. Sometimes it was possible, sometimes it wasn't possible. There was a huge trade, therefore, in small cylinders like this. Look at this place. These are women who clean the streets and they don't have any place where they can rest. And they've really been struggling to, to find support because most places now would just not let them come anywhere near them. This is a house in which migrant workers have been living. And when food was actually supplied to them, because part of what was happening during the lockdown was that most of these people were not able to access vegetables. So some of the relief material that went to them was actually about supplying them vegetables. And when people walk in, you find that there are literally dozens and dozens of people who need these resources, and they all walk in at the same time. This was a barricade that was done in one particular area because the neighborhood was scared of what was happening. And when somebody went there to say that I'm going to give you some materials to play with, the kids just queued up. Dozens and dozens of kids would come there to start collecting art supplies from some local non-governmental organization. People started cooking large amounts of food inside their homes to be able to feed other people around. Look at this. Can you recognize this tank, water tanker? This is how water supply has been coming to many places, right? And then let me show you one final set of images. This is an image that comes from some of the work that people were doing in our office because we were all forced to lock ourselves in our homes. And because we were forced to lock ourselves in our homes, we said one of the things that we should do is to start paying attention to how our own immediate spaces have begun to change. So what you see here is someone's balcony turning into a place where somebody goes and has coffee, someone trying to get exercise here, someone working from home, someone trying to communicate across these balconies. Not that all of this was not happening before the lockdown, but that this was the only mode that was available to people during the lockdown. That became very visible during this period. This is the image of women working in the courtyard in a low income area, which is visible from your balcony, right? And what you suddenly see is that you have men sitting there, you have children playing there, and then you have the women washing clothes, cooking, all of these kinds of things. All of it happening now here because there's just too many people inside the house now. And then you have the shops. So the reason why I wanted to show all of these images to you is that when we begin to think about the way in which our neighborhoods have begun to change and ask ourselves, is this the way in which we want to see our future in our cities? Is this the way in which our cities are going to work? Now, one of the conversations that I've been having with a lot of my friends across the world is that, is it possible that the ways in which we connect with other bodies has permanently changed? Because you're telling your kids now, don't hug other kids, don't go near them. We are having our homes reconverted into a situation where all of the teaching now has to happen at home. And so you have your actual living room being converted into a classroom substitute. Given all of this, do we have to rethink the way in which communities and community living can be organized? Can we begin to think of what kind of new construction work needs to be done and what can architects really do in this? Now, most of what I have said until now is actually the preface to what I wanted to say. What I wanted to actually say is this. I do believe that one of the things that COVID actually and the lockdown actually did for my own work is to confirm something that we have felt for a very long time. And what we have felt for a very long time is that architectural education has not paid sufficient attention in our country to repair work. We have trained our architects to build new buildings because it seems like the new building, the formal building, is where actual professional work can happen. But if you look at most of our cities, about 70 to 80% of what happens in our cities as built environment, new additions to it, are all incremental things that are done by masons, that are done by masons, that are done by people who figure out how to do these things by themselves, right? Over the last 3 years, we have, for example, looked at how dhobis in Hyderabad have been rebuilding their houses because they cannot any longer go to the tank where they can wash the clothes. So what they have been doing is to actually build washing platforms on top of their terraces. We found that potters have changed their houses, dairy people have changed the ways in which their houses are built. This is stuff that none of our architectural students are actually trained to do. So the question that we want to ask at this point of time is there a way in which we can retrain some of our architectural education towards thinking about building incrementally, building through repair and maintenance, building through repurposing what we already have, because 70 to 80% of actual construction work that happens in our cities is precisely that. And maybe that is where actually we have a lot of possibilities for improvement and a lot of possibilities for doing very serious research, because we know very, very little about how people actually build their houses. For example, we found that the way in which dhobis in Hyderabad have been building their houses has to do with where actually water is available, and they keep moving. They keep moving to find accommodation. They keep moving to find places where they can actually acquire water so that they can do washing at their own homes. To pull all of these things together, I think then that we really need to think about what kind of teaching do we need to do? What kind of orientation do we need to give them? Do we need to teach our students how to build septic tanks? Do we need to teach our students how to think about building rainwater harvesting structures in buildings which have already been built but never actually imagined as places which need to have rainwater harvesting? How do we do this? That's the kind of thing that I really want all of us to think about. And I do think that in the coming few years, the way our economy has tanked right now, this is where the new jobs are going to be. This is where the new economic activities are going to be. What we need to do is to figure out how to generate value And the Prime Minister, in some sense, was absolutely right that the only way we can do this is by paying attention to the local. So, what kinds of architectural resources, what kinds of skills and talents do we need to work in local neighborhoods? What idioms of construction do we need to learn? That's what we need to pay attention to. So I'll stop here and take a few questions and see if we can build on what I have said. Is that okay?
Yeah, fine, fine.
Yes, sir. We had a question from one of our participants, and he was asking about. It's interesting to understand that how urban kinetics has changed during this COVID situation, and how can we go further ahead? I mean, what else can we expect from this?
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by urban kinetics?
That is from a participant, sir. So that's just the way I received it. I think in terms of where we are using our spaces, about our social gatherings, and the images that you have shown us about how urban scenario is actually changing. So I think it's based on that.
The day-to-day activities
The
he
day-to-day
means
activity.
by him.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, you see, one of the difficult things at this current moment is that, um, except in places where there is a lot of attention about how people should be moving, we haven't really done a whole lot of documentation. And I think that the reason why we have been focusing so much on the visual, right, whether it is through photographs, whether it is through sketches, drawings, is that we really need to document how places have changed, what are the logics behind these changes, because without that we really don't know uh, what else can we imagine from this situation. For example, I know that there are a number of companies which have been working on how to build technologies for no contact, right? So you go to the airport, how do you make sure that a passenger can go all the way through into the aircraft and the seat without touching any surface, right? Do we need to do that kind of things about all the other stuff that happens in our houses, in our shops? Can we redesign a whole lot of our products to make that possible? I think these are things that are really up in the air.
Okay.
Correct.
Correct. Sir, there's another question, sir. What would be the rate of acceptance towards local over international materials by the local construction market? As you're saying, as you're talking about masons and everyone, how do you think they're going to accept towards that? And even users at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, this is actually a very interesting question, right? So for me, one of the things that we've learned is that most of your masons, most of your local economic actors do not think in terms of whether something is authentic and genuinely local or not. That is not what matters to them. What matters to them is whether or not it makes sense in economic terms, whether this is something that is cheap enough to build or not. What I do think we need to pay attention to then is not so much about the question of whether it is local or not local, but about what kind of places do we need to build locally, and therefore what kind of material do we need to use. Because a lot of the times what has begun to happen is that, let's imagine what happens in our schools. We have a lot of government schools now saying that kids will have to work from home and they will be receiving their classes online. What happens in government schools where students come to the school and be fed in the school? What happens to that midday meal that the kids were really, really depending on, right?
They are missing now.
Sorry?
They are missing the food now.
They're missing the food. But even more important here is that when we look at a lot of government schools, we have been often asking principals of these schools, particularly in girls' schools, about how many kids actually pass the exams. And we find that about 20 to 30% of students, even in the best of the schools, fail. And the girls who fail these 10th exam are girls who come from families where they actually have to do a lot of household work, either because it's a single parent home, or because there's domestic violence, or because there are too many kids and they have to take care of the younger siblings, all kinds of things. They're working at home, right? Now, where is the possibility for these girls to get any kind of outing at all? Once the school is locked down, these girls don't even get that few hours of being in a public place, which is what school was for them. So what you're seeing now is a strange situation in which a large number of people for whom mobility, being out there, was the only way in which they were actually getting some relief from oppressive homes is gone. So what kind of new public gathering spaces do we need to create, right? It is not as if in my neighborhood now we suddenly have, in the absence of a school, a place where girls can feel safe in coming and hanging together, reading a book, watching something. It's not possible for them. How do I build a place like that at a low cost? When I ask that question, I'm not going to ask whether I'm using Chinese material or not, right? I'm going to look for something that's going to work.
Yeah.
It might just be that, some throwaway Chinese junk is going to be very useful in building that. It's fine.
Yeah.
Sir, we have another question over here. What are the different type of interactive spaces or interaction spaces that are needed apart from balconies, especially in this time when we have to deal with COVID to avoid technology which students are getting addicted to. So even that is another thing, is that that's another side of the coin where children are really getting used to the technology. So how do we do it? So
Yeah.
what do you think? How
So
do you think?
that's a lovely question. One of the things that me and several friends of mine have been strongly pushing for is that we need to think of this whole problem at the neighborhood scale, right? Which means that, so you see, for an apartment complex, it may seem like your community is meeting each other through the balcony. For a large number of people, that may not even be possible at all. Just think about this. Most of our apartment buildings will not allow girls to go to the terrace. They will not allow them to go to the basement. In fact, one of the things that we did, and this is why I'm saying that a lot of the stuff that we are doing, it feels like lockdown has begun to emphasize, underscore things that we have already known. We used to run a football club in our neighborhood, and that basically happened because one of our researchers was an avid football player, and instead of doing statistical work, he wanted to go and play football most of the time. So we said, all right, so let's try and do some statistical work around football. So he would actually go and actually gather up kids and start playing football with them. What was interesting was a number of girls approached us immediately after they started seeing these boys playing football and said, you're creating some opportunities for boys. What about us? We can't go to the terrace. We can't go to the basement. We don't have a public park where we can go and play. Give us something, right? How do you now imagine a public space or a neighborhood space that is intimate enough, that is safe enough for girls? See, we need to think about community as consisting of people of very different kinds, right? We need to think about those bodies. How do we imagine a community space for women who have to step out of the house for a while? How do you build a place where a large number of girls actually wear the burqa so that they can walk through their neighborhood without being judged by somebody on the street, right? The street is not a very safe place for them, very friendly place for them. How do we make sure that at this point of time, given this particular time and opportunities, how do we bring women out onto the streets and make them feel safe? On any given street, you will see that you have the pan dabba, you have the street corner, you have the chai place, all kinds of locations, and only the pani puri bandi where you see the girls. There's no other place where girls can feel safe on these streets. How do we create those places? How do we create places which can serve multiple purposes, right? Say, imagine a library which can also serve as a gathering place. These were things that all of our cities had. They've disappeared now. How do we create such places at a low cost in an environment where you don't have any real estate available at all? Think about Delhi, for example, where they have created the Mohalla clinics. There was no real estate available. Where do you create a public infrastructure like a Mohalla clinic? You create it right next to the bus stop. Create a temporary structure and put it there, right? You do a kind of acupuncture into the urban environment. How do we build public toilets in our cities? You don't have sewer mains, you don't have water lines, and you don't have real estate available. And therefore, in most places where we actually need public toilets, we don't have them. So what we need to do then is to be very, very attentive to our neighborhoods and keep constantly looking for opportunities. And the studio environment is a great opportunity for us to play and experiment with stuff like this.
Okay. So there are a few more questions. Can I just go ahead with them?
Sure.
Okay, so there's another one and very interesting. What do you think could be the architect's role in this pandemic situation for digitalization, I'm sorry for that, of construction industry? If you want, I can repeat that again. What do you think could be the architect's role in this pandemic situation for digitalization of construction industry? I mean, when everything is getting digitalized, how do you think it's going to affect? I mean, unlike others, like software guys, they are used to it. Like ours is a very different profession. So how do you think it's going to change?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, no, I think that the question actually needs to be asked slightly differently, right? The point is not
basically the architects are getting more
we need
benefited
to
due to COVID-19.
Right? The point, yeah. How do we imagine architects working in a context where organized in all sorts of ways, right? So you have certain types of construction work which has remained. All of these different things have happened in the industry. Let us begin with the problem of the workers, because that's the easiest thing for me to imagine, right? One of the strange things that happened during this last lockdown is that a large number of construction workers who were waiting here to finish the summer's work and then go home had to stop that work and go home without finishing that work. And what we are realizing is that in some places they are coming back together. In some places they are saying that we want better housing. In some places they are saying we want something else. And what we discovered is that in most of the places where these workers have gone back to their villages, they have started the communication of the virus in the villages. This wouldn't have happened if we had had better housing, if we had had better opportunities, if we had had better connections between their homes and the places where they were working. So I think one of the things that needs to be done really is to imagine what kind of things need to be done in, number one, improving the uh, living conditions of migrant workers, especially in the construction industry. And I think that there's a lot of work that architects can do in that, right? How do we think through materials? How do we think through technologies? How do we think through design such that it actually becomes possible for migrant workers to live in a decent environment? And I think that in the coming months, coming years, this is going to be a big issue, and architects will have to play a major role in this. The second thing that I think becomes an issue is that for architects themselves, a sense of safety and security, because you don't want to go to the site, right? You because there's a risk in the site. A doctor is able to run an ICU remotely. Can an architect supervise or oversee construction or the quality of construction or operations from a distance? And I think it's an interesting question to ask, right? Whether it is possible or not is a different matter. But I think we should think about what is it that the architect can do from a distance without going to the site. How much of it can be done like that? Does it really need to be done like that? Or in attempting to do that, are we actually giving up the best qualities of being an architect? Yeah.
Right. There's another one, sir. Is it time for a reality check and put priorities in perspective? Should strengthening digital infrastructure be a priority at all, or should we accept this as a new normal? I mean, how do we go about it? Do we take it like, okay, this is the way it is going to be, and we go ahead with it, or is this the new normal?
I think in some ways, my own reading is that in some ways technology has a way of finding its own um, anchor points. There's nothing that we can really do to make it happen or not happen. What we really need to be attentive to is um, how best are we able to use technology to make certain kinds of socialities possible. And by that, what I mean, for example, is that 3 years ago, I was speaking to one of my friends who teaches, who's deeply involved in teaching architecture. And I was asking him, how do you teach structural engineering? And he said, we don't. What we have is actually a structural engineering consultant. And most of the work that students do is done through project work. So when they come to a structural problem, they try to figure it out by going online and learning whatever they have to learn, because so much is now available online. Now the consultant is available for the students to come back to and ask for resources, ask for pointers, ask for directions, and then they figure out what to do. Now that to me was actually a very, very revolutionary shift from the way in which I studied engineering. When I was studying engineering, I had the syllabi all set. I had a set of lessons. I had a set of principles to learn. I had a set of textbooks to follow, all of that. Now it looks like the whole world is available to you as a learning resource. And it is possible for you to construct learning projects in any given situation. Then the key thing for you to do is to figure out how do you build on each of these projects, right? So one of the ways in which we have been doing it, and I find it very interesting that there were resonances between the way in which we do our work and the way in which this teaching was happening. So in Hyderabad Urban Lab, one thing that we have always told people who come to work with us is that everybody does his or her work in a completely open format. That is, every single bit of information, data that you have captured, that you have generated, is going to be archived and available to someone else who wants to work with it. As a result, what happens is the output of a researcher is not the final form of the work that has been done. It might result in a publication in an academic journal. It might result in a very well presented, well crafted document or an exhibition or a small film or whatever. But what is actually a lot more important for me is the entire pathway through which this person went to produce that final output. So that would mean that there would be daily journal notings, and those journal notings could be sketches, drawings, writings, audio records, all kinds of things like that. What happens with that kind of material in our hands is that it becomes possible for another person to jump in and pick up and start a completely new project. So a lot of the things that we did in HUL were built like that over years by successive generations of interns. One example is in our first, second year or third year of our work, one planning student from SPA Delhi came and said, look, I need some interesting work. So what we did was to give him a list of all the public toilets in Hyderabad. He put them on a map, and then he developed an audit system for them. He went and used every single toilet. And of course, he produced a lot of pie charts about, how many of them were accessible wheelchair wise, how many of them were friendly to women, how many of them had broken light bulbs, how many of them had broken tubes, all of those kind of things. Subsequently, somebody else looked at the map and said, but explain to me, why is it that we have this clustering of toilets in the city? That is, you have some places where you have 4 or 5 toilets, in some places where you have a lot of public, but no toilet at all. And then you start digging into the financing models of toilets, and you discover something very unsettling. The reason why this kind of a strange clustering of toilets happens is because the government had this program of having toilets sponsored by corporate houses. And corporate houses in return wanted the walls of the toilets to be available for them for advertising. And there are desirable locations for advertising and there are undesirable locations for advertising. So actually toilets then got located in places where it makes very good sense to do wall-based advertising. As a result, you actually have a bunch of toilets which are actually hoardings with a toilet at the back, right? Then a group of 3 interns come and say, no, we are actually going to make a video film on the struggles of women in the city to find a women's toilet, a functional toilet. So they make a video on that. Then someone else comes along and says, we will use all of this and build a public website on which we can have discussions on what can be done in our cities to rethink the public toilet provision strategy, right? So that also happens. All of this happens over a period of time, and without digitalization, this wouldn't have been possible at all. Every single bit of this documentation was in the digital form, therefore it could travel a lot.
So there's another question, and what changes the architects should do in the thought process in planning the urban living and architecture to take care of future pandemics? So what is a thing that as an architect we can take care of, like in the planning process, which can help us further?
I think it's a very interesting question. See, to my mind, every time you have an epidemic, now it's calling it a pandemic, that is when cities actually change dramatically. And I don't think that any city has ever prepared itself for a pandemic or an epidemic that is going to come at some point of time in future. You can do this for the next few years. Think about your entire sewage system. Think about the way in which our roads have been built. The City Improvement Board of Glasgow was created when Glasgow port was put under embargo because there was plague. It was the City Improvement Board institutional form of Glasgow, which comes to Calcutta because you have epidemics in Calcutta. Trimalgiri in Secunderabad was the place where the first major work on a sanitation plan was made. All of these were done because of waterborne diseases. It's only when we discovered that it is through water that these diseases are coming, that it is through fecal matter that contamination happens, that we had to do a whole lot of reworking of our houses. So the City Improvement Board of Hyderabad, created in 2012, creates your Abid's Road, it creates your Mozamjahi Market, it creates your Pattargatti, it creates all of your CIB quarters in the city, all kinds of stuff with toilets.
So there is another one, a quick one. This is just in general, sir. What is the impact of COVID on education system and student psychology? This is in general. I mean, like, how do you think it has impacted this education system by itself and the children at the same time? It's a very
This is a moving target. One of the interesting things that we all need to do, and this is my strong appeal to all of you as teachers, as practitioners who are working with young people, is to pay attention to how people are learning, right? There are a number of interesting things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 months. One thing that has definitely happened is that every few days you have some new learning happening, that new learning about the disease being communicated to large numbers of audiences by people repeating it in multiple forms and formats, right? It's literally like the town crier, the bush telegraph. So somebody says something somewhere and then somebody else picks it up and then that person repeats it. And it's in that repetition that people learn a lot, right? So just about the disease, this is what has happened. What is not very clear and what we really should pay attention to now is that this is probably the first semester in which we are going to be seeing students working from home completely. Maybe things will change in October, maybe they will not. If they're working from home and if they're working on a studio project, how will they actually do the studio work? If they are PhD students who are supposed to be in the field and talking to people, how will they actually gather up the data that they need to gather up? How do people who need to learn things by talking to people face to face, how will they learn now? One of the interesting things that used to happen to me when lockdown began was a friend of mine would every couple of days say that, I want to come and meet you, right? And then there'd be complete panic in the house. This friend is coming to meet us. Why is he coming? Why can't we tell him, right? So then he would sense that something is happening and he would say, okay, so I'll stand near the gate. I'll sit in the basement, or you come to my house and we have a open yard in front of the house. I'll make sure that we will put 6 feet distance, all these things, right? But as I kept thinking about why he was so insistent, why can't he just do this through Zoom or WhatsApp or Google Meet or whatever, suddenly I realized something very interesting. He's a businessman. He's a businessman who makes sense of what is happening around him, takes decisions on the basis of what he imagines is information that he is getting tacitly from the people that he's talking to. So he needs to see my body language. He needs to look into my eyes. He needs to meet me physically for him to be able to take a decision. Now, Why is this important? It's important because a lot of what we learn is learned by watching other people do things, right? Most of our professions are like that. Take a nurse, you can't give her a manual and say, okay, here are instructions on how to give an injection, right? She is going to create a complete mess. For someone to learn how to give an injection, she has to watch somebody else give an injection, and she has to then go and attempt giving an injection, right? It's the same thing with cleaning our toilets, cleaning our sewage. There is so much that can only be learned by actually watching people do things, learning by sensing things with our muscles and our bodies. There's a student of mine who used to constantly talk about bone memory and muscle memory. And that is because she used to come with a very strong background in classical dance, that your body should be able to respond to things almost automatically. A tennis player would know that, when you swing your racket, you don't think. Your hand knows that the racket has to swing this way. So given all of these things, stuff that we have not paid enough attention to in our education, now we have to pay attention to this, because you see that students are going to fail because you don't have enough physical contact. How do you compensate for that? I have a number of interns, and I know that some of them have actually not done very well because they were not in the same room with me. They needed that very badly. And there were others who were able to do what they had to do without any difficulty at all. So you're going to learn different kinds of learning styles, strategies, personalities, and the best service that we can do to ourselves, to education, and to students is to keep notes on all of this. Keep track of who is learning how, including ourselves.
So for now, we're done with the queries, sir. So can we continue with the presentation?
Okay. So let me now, just give me 1 second. Give me 2 seconds. I want to pull out something for you to read.
Right, sir. Sure, sir.
Okay, so this is a passage that I was actually reading out to my office this morning. This is actually also the theme of a talk that I gave recently, and I thought this is an interesting way to start this conversation about where we can go with our construction industry now. So the essay is called Seizing the Day, and the brief paragraph that I wanted to read for you is this. COVID-19 and the national lockdown is an unprecedented moment of collapse of spatial scales. In city after city, millions of people, hitherto invisible, inhabiting hidden dwellings, suddenly poured onto the streets and began walking, cycling, riding bicycles, hitching rides in passing trucks, often hungry and thirsty, doing feats that tested the limits of endurance of the body. As people deployed knowledge and ignorance tactically, relied on networks of trust to get by, figured out how to make neighborhoods survive, COVID-19 international lockdown did what the theorist and practitioner has not been able to do on one's own until now: decenter both the theorist and the practitioner. We are witnessing an uncertainty of an unprecedented degree. This democratization of practice and theory is the single most important outcome of the last 3 months. What do I mean by a number of the words that I have used here? First, the title, Seizing the Day for Southern Urbanism, and I need to explain a little bit about what I mean by Southern Urbanism. Southern urbanism is an expression that comes from some of the work that has been happening in thinking about cities and architecture over the last about 20 years or so. It actually began at many different locations, but one of the most inspiring pieces was by a British geographer of Indian origin called Ash Amin. Must have been Ashfaq Amin. Ash Amin co-authored a piece called The Ordinary City. And the ordinary city was meant to be a way of signaling that the way in which we think about our cities will have to be broken down into not categorizing cities too much, but to be attentive to the small details of everything that happens in our cities. And when you do that, we begin to realize that cities are actually made up of multiple cities which are happening simultaneously. And it is this idea that the city is actually a multiplex of simultaneous experiences, simultaneous existence of different kinds of built environments. That is where a lot of new investigations began. And one set of investigations was around architecture and how do architectural styles travel. One set of ideas were around should we be actually thinking of making our cities look like some other cities? Are there ways in which we can create hierarchies of cities? Is there something to be said for holding on to the idea that all cities are the same? They all operate on the same principle of people coexisting and learning from each other, and therefore they ought to be created as open entities. How do we do all of this, right? My own involvement with this began in multiple ways. One of the sources of this was a course that I was teaching in Singapore, along with another colleague of mine, a course called Global Cities. And what we found, to our utter dismay, was that most of the reading materials that we had for our students made our students feel very, very inadequate. So you have students coming from small towns, big cities in Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and we are teaching them about what cities should look like, and we are telling them that this should look like Chicago, this is what you have in London, and so on. And everybody begins to imagine that the best way to build a city is to build it like London. The best way to build a city is to build it like Chicago. And we were quite shocked that this is how people were understanding it, that they did not have any other way of engaging with that material. Subsequently, a number of other people working on these kinds of issues also began to write that we need to think about small towns, non-metro centers, which are also urban. We also need to think about the ways in which a large part of the world outside of the sheen of big global accumulation centers like London, Chicago, Tokyo, New York, maybe. And all of these other places were called places from where southern urban theory can come. And southern there actually means global south, that is the southern hemisphere, very broadly speaking, but the southern hemisphere kind of characteristics can also be in the northern hemisphere, which is that these are underdeveloped, not completely first world kind of places. And we realize that, in Hyderabad, it's perfectly possible to have a place that looks a bit like Chicago, but you also have a place that doesn't look like Chicago at all. So how do we then put all of these different kinds of ideas together? And we've been struggling over the last 10, 15 years to think about how to theorize these places. One of the things we realized is that, and this has been the biggest learning for us from Hyderabad Urban Lab, that we really don't have any way of theorizing in the abstract. The only way we can do this, and this connects back to that earlier question of being physically present in the construction site, right? We learn a lot about our cities by being physically present here. So what we began to do was to locate ourselves in neighborhoods. That's why we went to Bholakpur. That's why we have our entire operations in Siddiq Nagar or in some other location, to be something that happens from inside the place. Because when you are inside a place, you begin to learn how places work. You begin to learn how people think in those places, and we put all of those ideas together. Give an example. You have many places in Delhi which are called unauthorized colonies. The government of Delhi, the High Court has ordered that all these unauthorized colonies should be authorized now, with the rider that so long as all the buildings are following norms of building rules. Now, which unauthorized colony will have buildings which are built according to building codes? And if your buildings are not according to those building codes, then if the building cannot be regularized, then the entire neighborhood runs into this very peculiar situation where you say the entire area is regularized, but none of the buildings is regularized. As you struggle with these kinds of things, questions about where will the money come from, because if you're living in an unauthorized colony and you want to build and extend your house, you need financing. And you will not get a loan from any of the banks unless the bank is given documents saying that the building is actually regularized. It's in situations like that you have a large number of informal financiers who step in. And these informal financiers then have a way of judging whether or not a property owner is worth financing. And when you push and try to find out how do they judge, they all come back to one very simple thing. Inki niyat theek nahi hai, ya inki niyat theek hai. And you don't know when it finally comes down to questions like niyat, iman, shame, how do people make these calls? How do people judge what is appropriate and what is not appropriate? As we begin to think about these kinds of questions, at this point of time, when so many people have begun to move all over, new kinds of personalities that were never visible to us in the cities have become visible. One of the things that we've realized is that we cannot any longer think in terms of theory and practice as two separate things. Theory is practice, and practice is theory. So what we have begun to sense to be our main occupation now is that we have to be very, very respectful to people with lots of experience. We need to go in and push and experiment with what is happening in our cities in terms of built environments, put stuff together. And as we are putting all of these different kinds of activities together, gradually we realize that theory of some kind of intermediate level ideas will emerge from this experience itself. And that's what we were trying to say in this essay called Seizing the Day. That is, at this point of time, you have suddenly a moment when the world is offering you opportunities to learn in ways that were not available to us ever in the past. Let me give you a number of examples of how this is happening. In the second week of the lockdown, I was part of a group that was offering food to people who were clearly going to be starving without support. And the people who were doing this work were local businessmen, because they realized that this is the time for them to build relationships with people. This is the time for them to rise up to the occasion and feed people. And all kinds of people started jumping in and started feeding people. I've never seen this kind of generosity in in any context anywhere. I've seen men in a number of areas um, trying to take care of migrant workers, trying to say that let's build field hospitals, trying to say that let's build other support structures for this. Some of it will have to be physical built environment, some of it will have to be stitching together services, all kinds of things. What we haven't seen is a lot of this expertise actually now resulting in something very concrete. We have seen some big infrastructures being created here and there. We haven't quite seen um, the type of emergency relief hospitals that needed to be built. We haven't seen a lot of migrant workers housing that needed to be done. We haven't seen a lot of neighborhood infrastructures that needed to be created. And I think that in the coming months, this is where opportunities for both architects and construction industry actually lies. How do you build infrastructures that are lightweight, that are easy to move, that can be flexible, that can be acupunctured literally into neighborhoods, into places, and can be managed by people locally? So, in that sense, what we need to push for is a certain kind of democratization of technology. And in terms of creating opportunities for the millions and millions of people in the informal economy, which is 90% of it is actually micro enterprises, right? So what kinds of new opportunities can we create in that? So can we think in terms of some sort of building arts diploma programs? Can we train a large number of rainwater harvesting teams in the city? Can we train a large number of people who can repurpose old buildings and bring it back online? Can we have the moral courage in our city, which is supplied by architects, planners, builders, who will say that this is an opportunity for us to make all of this built environment again coming back into the city as commons? Because what was great about Hyderabad was its common spaces. You had hundreds of lakes, and these lakes were common spaces, right? You had hundreds of parks, which were common spaces. We had hundreds of buildings that were meant for public use. And it's those open, large public spaces and really, really vibrant local mobile infrastructures. That's what we need to push for. And I think that the opportunity for the construction industry and for architects really lies there. And if we can build research programs that allow us to do this, it'll be the best way of doing it.
That was really beautiful, sir. Thank you. Thank you. So I would just like to thank Professor Anand for the excellent session on community and living or catalyzing post-COVID construction. the insight on spaces and the way people think and react to situations, I think that was really beautiful. The human scale perspective to housing for migrants in the urban scenario, the sketches they reflected, they spoke a lot. I mean, in between the lines, you could read a lot from that, which in turn I'm sure will help architects, designers, and students to incorporate it in their design and build environment to make better places. And I think post COVID, I'm sure it will really help us with that. Uh, his ideas and thoughts are highly informative to all the participants and definitely helps us to be prepared for the near future. Thank you, sir, once again. And it was a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Kripa. Over to Kripa.
Thank you very much, Anand sir. So this is a small announcement for the participants for tomorrow, basically. We have two speakers for tomorrow's session. We have Dr. Harish Gupta, faculty, Usmania University College of Engineering, and we have Dr. A. Sujit Reddy. Both of them will be talking on climate responsive issues like so the session starts at 10 a.m. tomorrow, same time as it did today, and we will be having two sessions for tomorrow. Post lunch, we would not have a session as it being a Sunday. So, any queries, you can reach out to us via the WhatsApp group that we have created. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krupa. Thank you to Ananta Mariganti garu. He rightly expressed about the COVID situation and how to come about it, and also he expressed his wide knowledge and understanding, and he also raised a thought process about the architects, how they should think, and it is a wonderful session altogether, and I hope the architects will learn from his experience, and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Request the participants to join 10 minutes prior to the session tomorrow.
So, Krupa, are we concluding the session today, or is there anything?
Yes, sir. This is our third session. This is the third speaker for